Ok, já que o senhor sugeriu, então conte aqui para nossa audiência o que os achados internos de Nazaré mais te surpreenderam e mais chamaram a sua atenção como um pesquisador e como um arqueólogo.
So, within Nazareth, there has been very little archaeological work done. Again, this comes as a surprise to us when we think of the fame of Nazareth, but it really was a very insignificant place apart from its relationship to the story of Jesus in terms of the Roman Empire. Now, when we do come to look at the archaeology of Nazareth, there is a couple of things that are very surprising. The first thing is, we don't know how big it was. You often hear people say Nazareth was a village, it was a very small place, a cluster of houses, what we call in English a hamlet. And the Bible seems to use a word for it that strictly translated would mean city, polis. Well, so how big was it? People have tried in the past, that is to say, archaeologists have tried in the past, to work out the limits of the first century settlement at Nazareth by mapping the tombs, the Jewish tombs, known from the Roman period around the city of Nazareth, and saying, well, because they would have been outside the occupied area, the settlement area, that gives us a sort of maximum limit to the settlement area. The problem is that in our work, we found, on the one hand, if you apply modern archaeological dating to the tombs known from Nazareth, they're all later than the period of Jesus's activity there. So they're irrelevant to that. But also, at a couple of sites, occupation occurred very close or even on the same site as later tombs. So there's every reason to suppose that we can't use the tombs to form a ring around the settlement area of Nazareth in the time of Jesus, even if we can later in the Roman period. So that's I think, a very interesting thing. We just don't know from archaeology, often written sources, how big Nazareth was. And that term polis in the Bible is used for settlements of all sorts of different sizes, not just for what it strictly means in classical Greek as town. And we find that in other first century Greek sources, so that's not exceptional. Another interesting thing we found in the centre of Nazareth was a very well preserved first century house. Now, few surface built buildings are even today known from first century Nazareth. The one we identified in my work, which had been actually excavated as early as the 19th century. Well, the actual house had been excavated in the very early years of the 20th century, but the site had been excavated in the late years of the 19th century. And there's another house that was actually found by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, Israeli archaeologists, on a building site while we were working on the house that we had identified. So we now have 2 first-century houses from Nazareth, one of which was in my project, one of which the Israelis excavated. They have some similarities to each other, but the big difference was the house that was found by Israeli archaeologists was on a relatively flat place, and so was built up with stone walls. And the house that we were looking at was on a steep slope, so was terraced back by cutting back the rock of the hillside. And understandably, the people who had done so had made some of the walls out of the rock of the hillside by cutting the rock to form the walls, if you see what I mean. So those walls, because they were purely of rock, were much better preserved than any of the other walls on both of those house sides. And so, as a consequence, much more of the structure of the house we found, or we identified, it had been found earlier, but not studied by archaeologists. Much more of the walls had actually survived, and the preservation was quite good. We could recognize a doorway through walls that were standing above head height. We could recognize a rock-cut stairway up to what was either the roof level or the start of an upper story of the building. And that is a level of preservation which you seldom get on early Roman rural sites in Galilee, or for that matter in anywhere else in the Roman provinces. So that was quite nice, and it was nice to be able to have 2 examples of first century houses from the settlement in which Jesus lived as a child and as a young man, and which, for that matter, Mary and Joseph and James will have lived also. So that is exciting stuff. There might be something special about the house that we identified, or I identified. We often say in archaeological projects we, because when I do this work, I work with a team. Yes. This is not the royal we. We are not making ourselves sound more important. We are referring to the team I directed. So the house that we found, we identified, was the subject of later veneration by Christians who built a church next to it, a cave church, an artificial cave used as a church, probably in the 4th century. Then a big church over it in the 5th century, and that was used into the 7th and probably 8th centuries. And that was then rebuilt after it had fallen into disuse, probably, by the Crusaders. And again, as a big church, only to be destroyed by fire when the Crusaders lost the city of Nazareth at the end of the 12th century. So we can say on archaeological grounds that this place that the house was venerated by Christians from at least the 4th century. We don't know whether Christians venerated it before that. But we can identify the churches that the Byzantines and the Crusaders built on that site. And they were dedicated to the upbringing of Christ by Mary and Joseph, of course. When the Byzantine church, which was still used in the 7th century after the Arab conquest, was described in the 7th century, it was said that it contained in its crypt, in its cellar, the remains of a house. And that house was where Jesus was brought up. It's what later scholars call the house of the nutrition, and they call the church of the nutrition. So it is possible, though beyond the realms of archaeology, to prove that that house was believed to be the house where Jesus lived. And that, of course, as you probably know, has attracted a lot of attention from people in the media, from people in the general public, around the world since its discovery. And on average, I still do an interview for the media across the world once a week or twice a week about it. But of course, as an archaeologist, all I can say is it was a 1st century church, a 1st century house, rather, not a church, 1st century house that was used as a place where a church was built dedicated to the upbringing of Christ. So you can decide for yourself whether you think it probably was Jesus's house in Nazareth, or it was just a house in the Nazareth that Jesus would have known. In any case, as someone pointed out to me when I was in Nazareth, in the context of a Middle Eastern village in the early Roman period, it would probably be a house that Jesus not only knew as a building, but had been inside. So it is a tangible piece of evidence from what might be called Jesus's Nazareth. In fact, the title of my book, presenting this to the general public, which is now translated into Portuguese, is The Archaeology of Jesus's Nazareth.